March 15th, 1945, 07:30 hours. Railway station, Somerset, England. Obergefreiter Karl Hoffmann stepped down into a milk-white mist that made the hedgerows look painted on. Stone walls stitched green fields. The trees were still winter bare, but a thin lace of new leaves hinted at spring. Around him, 23 other German prisoners formed something like a line because soldiering is a habit even after the uniforms fray. They were tired from the long haul down from Yorkshire, uncertain in the way men are when the rules change again. Propaganda had promised cruelty. 18 months in British captivity had quietly contradicted it. This was different. The notice pinned to the camp board had been clear. Farm work, living among civilians, no wire, no towers. The whispers in German were careful and quick. What if the locals spit at us? What if they refuse to work with us? What if this is what punishment really looks like? A British corporal approached, middle-aged, weather-browned, the face of a man who'd spent the war doing necessary jobs no one would write poems about. Clipboard tucked under one arm. His German had corners, but carried the meaning. "Right then," he said. "You lot are being assigned to farms in the district. 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, planting, harvesting, mending, feeding, whatever the farmer requires. You'll be supervised and treated fairly. Work hard, behave properly, and you'll get on. Cause trouble, and you'll be back at camp to face discipline. Questions?" "None." He nodded, read from the board, and began to match names to places. Hoffman, Meadowbrook Farm, 3 miles east, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, dairy and crops. The vehicle that rattled up wasn't army olive drab. It was a civilian farm lorry with a bed full of tools. The driver climbed down, a woman in her 50s, Wellington boots laced with mud, hair pinned hard against the wind. She studied the 3 men assigned to her, a measuring, not a verdict. "Right," she said in brisk English. "Back you get. Mind the tools." They drove through a countryside that seemed indecently peaceful after 1939. No bomb damage, no ruined streets, only stone farmhouses, sheep on slopes, the wet brown smell of plowed earth. War was not absent here. It was simply not visible in the way Karl knew it could be. Meadowbrook appeared around a bend. Slate-roofed house, low barns, fields like open books. The woman parked. A gray-haired man straightened from a fence repair, moved with the careful economy of someone who'd been using his body as a tool his whole life. Husband, surely. He weighed the prisoners with the same narrow-eyed assessment, then glanced at his wife. A quick exchange in English, a small nod. He turned to the men and tried German. "Work good, good treatment," he said. "Bad work, no work. Understand?" Karl nodded. "Verstanden." "Right then," Mr. Patterson said and gestured toward the dairy. "Milk cows first, show you how." As they crossed the yard, Mrs. Patterson stepped from the kitchen door with a tray, white mugs rattling on saucers. She held one out to each man. Tea, hot, milky, sugared. Karl stared at the mug as if it might be a trick. Britain and Germany were still at war. The Pattersons' son could be fighting in Germany right now. Yet she offered tea to enemy soldiers like it was the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Patterson saw his confusion, tried slower English. "Long day," she said, tapping her watch. Then the mug. "Work better, with tea." No grand absolution, no speech. Simply the British comprehension that fuel is fuel. And if you want work done, you feed the workers, even when the workers are yesterday's enemies. Karl sipped and tasted milk and sugar, luxuries too rare to waste on an idea of vengeance, and understood that whatever he had braced for, reality would be more complicated. How the farm system worked Britain's decision to send German POWs into fields was not sentiment, it was necessity. By 1944, more than 500,000 farm workers had been pulled into the forces or war industry. The country ate because domestic agriculture worked and because convoys crossed the Atlantic through U-boat country. If crops rotted for lack of hands, paper ration books became jokes. There were over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in Britain by 1945. The Geneva Conventions permitted agricultural labor. The arithmetic wrote itself: put idle men where crops needed picking. War Agricultural Executive Committees, the War Ags, took requests, matched farms and prisoners, and set out rules. Farmers would supervise. The army would keep a light hand. The aim was food, not theater. It required civilian cooperation. Some had lost sons at Dunkirk, husbands in the desert, houses in the Blitz. And yet the potatoes would not lift themselves from the ground. Britain, when pushed, is a practical country. The decision was proof. First week at Meadowbrook, routine formed quickly because routine always does where work is honest. Wake at 6 in the billet, a converted barn with cots, a stove, and the sort of furniture that looks tired but stands straight. Walk across the yard to the farmhouse. Tea and bread at the back door. Then assignments, milking, learned by watching Mr. Patterson's hands and copying the rhythm until the teats let go without fuss. Mucking out, which needed only a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and the ability to do without complaint. Fence repair, where knots and wire taught a new vocabulary. Feeding, measured by numbers chalked onto a slate by the door. Mr. Patterson supervised, demonstrated, then stepped back. He didn't hover, he didn't bark. If a job came back sloppy, he corrected with the tone competent men reserve for errors that mustn't repeat. His rule was clean. Do the task right, and we get on fine. Do it wrong, and we do it again until it's right. The language gap narrowed by the hour. His German stayed limited, their English improved by necessity. Hands did most of the talking, a nod, a point, a pantomimed motion. By Friday, a rough work pigeon had emerged, made of nouns, verbs, gestures, and goodwill. What surprised Carl most was the absence of rage. He had expected cold forms of punishment dressed up as procedure, tools withheld, tasks assigned to humiliate, food shaved to the thinnest edge of acceptable. Instead, the Pattersons were correct, not friendly, not cruel, proper. They extended what was needed to get the work done, then expected the work to be done. Mrs. Patterson brought tea mid-morning and mid-afternoon, always with the same brisk "there we are" that brooked neither argument nor gratitude speeches. When Heinrich tore his hand on wire, she cleaned and bandaged it with the same competence she would have used on her husband. Breakfast was tea and bread. Noon meant bread, cheese, sometimes cold meat. Evening brought a hot dish. Stew on good days, something honest on lean days. Back to the billet. A letter home if you wanted. Censored, yes, but words nonetheless. Sleep. Repeat. No one shot at you. You woke to cows rather than sirens. Monotony, but also mercy. The village ways. In Somerset received its Germans the way it receives weather. It noticed, it grumbled or approved, and it carried on. There were sharp edges. Mrs. Pemberton, who had lost a son at Dunkirk, would cross the street rather than pass them on the pavement. Mr. Davies, bombed out of his Bristol house, muttered "Bloody Jerry's" loud enough to be heard, and not quite loud enough to be replied to. But most people were practical. The men worked, the farms needed them, the village needed the farms. The vicar, Reverend Whitmore, had been a chaplain in the last war, and said from the pulpit, "The Lord's house is open to all," which settled the matter for everyone who cared what the vicar said. On Easter 1945, 3 prisoners sat in the back pew. They did not take communion. They sang hymns in German, while the congregation sang in English. Ein feste Burg, braided with "a mighty fortress." Some shifted in discomfort. Others wept quietly because grief makes harmony into a kind of truce. The pub kept its principles by not needing to test them. The landlord declared British beer for British men, then learned the prisoners had no intention of coming in for beer. He polished glasses harder and let it lie. Mrs. Patterson's version. Most were sensible. The lads worked hard and behaved. Being nasty wouldn't bring anyone back. Best to get on. When the wire vanished security, like fog thinned with the sun of routine. At first, escorts walked prisoners from billet to farm and back again, home guard men with rifles at ease and stories they preferred telling to their grandchildren in the future tense. By the summer of 1945, after Germany's surrender, escorts fell away. The men walked themselves to work and back, passing stone walls and dogs who reserved their barking for strangers, not for men who now smelled like the farm. They could have run. Britain is an island, Germany was occupied and in ruins. Where would they go? We were warm, Karl said later. We were fed, we were treated correctly. To run would be to exchange safety and honest work for hunger and hiding. Nonsense. Rules relaxed in other ways too. There were regulations about no meals in the farmhouse kitchen. Regulations do not always survive contact with Sunday. Mrs. Patterson began inviting the three of them in for Sunday dinner. Roast if there was roast, vegetables, a pudding if the sugar stretched, tea in proper cups. The first time, Karl balked. "You invite us to your table?" he asked in his careful English. "You work hard all week," she said, as if that were the entire argument. It was. Conversation at first was about weather, because English people use weather the way others use small talk. Then it was about tractors and calving. Mr. Patterson spoke slowly. Karl answered with the words he had. Mrs. Patterson corrected pronunciation without making correction feel like scolding. It was domestic in the precise way that heals. Trust showed itself in tasks. Mr. Patterson taught Karl to drive the tractor and to maintain it. Grease points, plugs, the blessed habit of listening for wrong sounds. When it failed during plowing, Karl repaired it with skills learned in a peacetime mechanic's shop and a wartime army that had always needed machines to move. Mr. Patterson's good work felt like a medal more honest than metal. Wolfgang, a carpenter before the war, was given charge of repairing the big barn door. Measure, cut, hang, square. The finished joinery was clean enough to make a man smile. Mr. Patterson shook his hand. First time he'd offered that. Respect, not sentiment. Respect went both ways. When storms threatened the wheat, the prisoners worked past dark without being asked, because crops are calendars that do not read excuses. When Mr. Patterson wrenched his back and had to spend 3 days flat, the men ran the farm as if they had been born to it. They had not. They were simply trusted, and trust is a moral fuel. The conversations that matter. As words improved, the questions did too. One evening in autumn 1945, mending a far fence while the light went weak, Mr. Patterson asked it, head-on without malice. "Why did you fight for Hitler?" Man was mad. Karl took care with his English because care was owed. "We were told we defend Germany," he said. "Told last war was unfair. Told enemies everywhere. Many lies. We believed." Mr. Patterson tightened wire, considered, nodded. "My brother fought in the last war," he said. "Came home different. Never said much. I expect those Germans were told they were defending their homes too. Still wrong. Orders being orders doesn't make them right. But I suppose you know that now." "Yes," Karl said. "Too late for many, but yes." Mrs. Patterson asked different questions, softer around the edges and sharper underneath. "Family," she said one kitchen afternoon, washing and drying with the practiced rhythm that keeps a house alive. "My wife, daughter," Karl said. "Hamburg." She set the plate down and squeezed the tea towel once. "Must be hard," she said, not knowing. A pause. "Our boys in Berlin with the engineers, helping put up what was knocked down. Strange world. My son helping Germans rebuild. Germans helping us harvest. Strange good, Carl ventured. Better than the other sort, she said. Leaving and staying repatriation started in 1946 and flowed into 1947. Men went home to rubble, rationing and uncertainty. Some did not go, not yet. Britain allowed former POWs to remain temporarily as civilian workers because farms needed hands and because decency had turned into competence. Karl's flat in Hamburg had been flattened. His wife and daughter were with relatives in the countryside, alive, managing more than living. The authorities offered him a path. Stay on, civilian wages, a cottage instead of a billet, the right to walk to town because walking to town was no longer an escape, just an errand. He could send money home. He could return later with something more than apologies. Mr. Patterson put it plainly. Stay on as hired man if you like, he said. Proper pay. You work well. I'd rather keep a good man than hope a stranger proves one. Carl accepted. The work did not change. The status did. A key replaced a permission. A wage packet replaced a prisoner's stipend. The same dawn, the same cows, the same mud. Now carrying the dignity of choice. Wolfgang stayed for good. He married a British woman he'd met at church, built a carpentry business, and raised children who grew up on English tales and German lullabies. Others settled nearby. A small archipelago of former enemies became a community of neighbors who brought the right tool when asked, and sometimes when not. Carl returned to Germany in 1949. The Pattersons stood with him on the station platform and sent him off with a packed lunch, a folded letter of reference, and Mrs. Patterson's eyes glassy in a way she would never admit aloud. They wrote letters across the years, farm news and village births from Somerset, the rebuilding of Hamburg, the climb of a daughter through school and then to marriage. In 1965, a telegram from Meadowbrook arrived for the wedding day. Congratulations and best wishes for a happy future. Patterson family, Meadowbrook Farm. Carl framed it. In 1977, when Mr. Patterson died at 83, Carl crossed back over and stood in the same church where he had once sung a German hymn as a prisoner. He sang in English as a mourner. Mrs. Patterson squeezed his hand hard at the graveside. Father always said you were the best worker he ever hired, she told him. Thank you for coming. What it proved. The use of German POWs on British farms is often retold as a soft story. It wasn't soft. It was practical. It was also something greater. In field after field, kitchen after kitchen, Britain practiced a version of strength that looks dull in a headline and devastating in a life. Standards kept on purpose. It worked in 3 dimensions. Practical. Food was grown and harvested. Tractors ran. Fences stood. Children ate. Strategic. Treatment spoke louder than leaflets. German prisoners wrote home about fairness that could not be faked across borders and censors. Moral. A democracy under strain refused to descend in order to prove it could rise. For men like Carl, the impact was not a speech. It was a sequence of days. A mug of tea before milking. A bandage applied without commentary. A Sunday dinner seat offered because there was room. A tractor key placed in his hand because he had earned it. None of these moments shout. Together, they overturn an education. The British beat us in the field, Carl said years later. They beat us more completely by treating us fairly when they did not have to. They showed me what civilization actually is. Not slogans, not race theories. Standards. Kept. Closing the gate. The mist that first morning had been the sort that lifts by 10. By the end of the year, the fear had done the same. The men walked lanes where sparrows fussed and dogs learned their names. They worked and were worked with. They earned trust and it was returned. They wrote letters that were more than words. They were proofs. Years later, when the hedges were higher and the tractor was newer and Wolfgang's children had outgrown the corner pew where they once sat swinging their legs, Meadowbrook still felt like what Britain had chosen to be when it could have chosen otherwise. Restrained, practical, decent. Karl, in Hamburg, kept the telegram in its frame and the habits he had learned in Somerset. Bank the fire properly. Mend what can be mended, speak directly and fairly, believe that dignity, once given, tends to return. He told his daughter what Mrs. Patterson told him on a Sunday when the roast was late and the world was still stitching itself back together. "Strange world," she said, "but perhaps the good kind of strange." It was. And in that strangeness, tea before work for men who had been enemies, a tractor trusted to hands that had once held other machines, a hymn shared in two languages on the same breath, lay the quiet victory that outlasted the uniforms. Real strength is restraint, and civilization is a standard you keep, especially when you don't have to